Welcome to part 2 of this 3-part series on the biblical history of Israel. My dad joins me today and continues our conversation, starting with important events happening in 1917 all the way to 1982 and what that means for us today. If you haven't watched part 1, please go and do this as it ties directly into this episode. And today covers some intense topics, particularly World War II, anti-Semitism, and some of my opa's personal experience in the war. But we felt it was necessary to address these issues, particularly as Christians. I hope this helps and encourages you immensely. Welcome to the Conservative Pentecostal podcast. My name is Yannicka and I'm your host. This podcast is a New Zealand-based ministry about my journey from being a conservative Christian who moved to Pentecostalism and then eventually returned to conservative Christianity. Myself and my guests talk about false teachings in the charismatic church, worship, church theology, marriage, and finding rest in Christ alone. I hope this episode helps and encourages you. All right, well, let's go into the 1900s then. There's quite a lot to talk about in that time period. So let's begin then with 1917. What happened then?
Well, again, we need to take a bit of a leap. So in the time of, I think, the year from the Maccabean revolt to 1917, a lot of other things happened as well in world history. Around the year 634, there was a gentleman called Muhammad the Prophet, and he was professed to be the one who was the founder of modern-day Islam. Through the centuries, there were a number of caliphates, which is a ruling entity exercising law based on Islam or Islamic teachings. Of course, we had the Crusades in that time. There's another big one. And around the 15th century, the Turks actually took possession of the land of Palestine. So the Turks had an empire, not as vast as the previous empires, but big nevertheless. And they were also a Muslim nation. And they actually occupied the land of Palestine or Palestina. And in 1917, there was, leading up to 1917, the Brits. So this is in the First World War, which went from 1914 to 1918. We know all about it as Kiwis because we always commemorate Gallipoli, which was in that particular time frame. So this is what the Brits were prominent in the world because the British Empire was still in existence. And they were also administering law and maintaining law and order and administration of the countries that they were asked to occupy part of it. In some areas, such as the land of Palestine, they decided to free the land of Palestine and the city of Jerusalem, and there was the Brits actually threw the Turks out, and that was in 1917. The brigade that actually liberated Jerusalem was a New Zealand brigade or an army unit. I think it was mounted cavalry that actually liberated Jerusalem. And they are still, as of today, they have still commemorated the Jews of today and the Kiwis. They still have exchanged. There is actually a monument there in Jerusalem that the New Zealand Army liberated Jerusalem. So there is a bit of history there that we should be proud of as Kiwis. But 1917, there was a lord, and his name was Lord Balfour. And he thought that it was a good plan and his contemporaries to create a homeland for the Jews. And so he proposed that in the League of Nations. And the League of Nations agreed with him and said, yes, we should actually. And so from that onwards, prior to 1917, there were people that used the movement of the Zionist movement which effectively were people who were endeavoring to find a homeland for the Jews in the diaspora. And while that was sort of happening, in that land of Palestina in these days, 1917 and prior, let's say in the 30 or 40 years prior, Arabs and Jews lived together in that land. And then it was under Turkish rule, and then later on, after 1917, under British rule. So when Lord Balfour made that declaration for a homeland for the Jews, the League of Nations, which is the predecessor of the United Nations, agreed with him and said, asked the Brits if they would try to organize a proposal, or how they thought that would go. And the first maps that were drawn were quite significantly larger than what Israel is today, very much different. It was a very big area. And you must realize in that time, not that long ago, it's 100 years, just over 100 years ago, that the country of Jordan was not in existence. It was created by the Brits working together with the French, because they also had the finger in the pie there. And so the land was just, probably somebody got a ruler out of some description and started to sort of draw lines, so you can still see the old maps, how they did that. So when they actually proposed a new homeland for the Jews, it was a significantly big land, all the way going to the current Iraq. That was a chunk, and then all the way down towards the Sinai, not the Sinai, but towards the Sinai, etc., and a part of the Lebanon and a bit of Syria. So that was sort of following up from 1917. And then we actually end up with a few skirmishes on the way up to the year 1929. There was an event in 1929 that requires some in-depth explanation of where the current conflict actually started.
Okay, well, I think it's important to talk about that in 1929, so let's talk about it.
August 1929, a quite significant event happened, and that was the result of what happened previously. So when the Brits started to think of creating a Jewish homeland, the Arab population at that stage lived together with Jews in Palestina. Now, over these years, the Jews came to the land of Israel, and they purchased land from wealthy Arab landowners who were absent, and they actually sold the land to these Jewish settlers at exorbitant prices. But what actually was happening is that the relationship between the Arabs and the Jews, and there was a large community in the city of Hebron, and it's in the area of Judea and Samaria, a very important place because today there's a lot of Jews that are trying to preserve that area for the fact that the graves of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob are there. And so the history goes back all the way to what we've just come from a while ago with Genesis 12 and 15. So these people lived together, Jews and Arabs together, and they were going to each other's weddings in these days. So just before that time, let's say towards the 1940s, there was an estimation of about 900,000 people in the land of Palestina. And 40%, they estimate, according to British administrators, was Jewish, and the other was 60% was Arabs. Now, it wasn't all. I mean, I've heard these young people screaming and saying they were all living in peace, and then it all went wrong after the state of Israel was announced in 1948. Well, that is the first incorrect statement. But let's go a little bit deeper in August 1929. Because in these days, the Brits were trying to discuss things with both populations. It was not only Jews and Arabs, there were other nationalities or ethnic groups there as well, like the Druses, and there were Christians there in the land of Palestine. Somebody began to see that it was not going their way, and those were mostly Arabs. Now, one particular Arab was of the opinion that there was really no place for the Jews, and he was actually not, I think a few years before that, appointed by the Brits to be the spokesperson for the Muslims and the Arabs that lived in that particular area. Well, he was the Grand Mufti, and his name was Amin al-Husseini. And like I said, he was the Grand Mufti. And he was appointed by the Brits to represent the people in that particular land. Now, there is, to be honest, a shocking likeness of the way things started to develop in that particular time with what has happened recently in our time. So there was brochures and leaflets were spread that the Jews were going to take the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Well, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is in Jerusalem. It was built by Muslim occupiers. The Turks had occupied, and there were caliphates before that. And they built it exactly of where the Second Temple was.
Oh, wow.
Now, there is such a thing that has happened over the period, let's say from 1929, just before, to now, let's say the last 100 years, and it's called the term cultural appropriation. So, like I said, there is this group in Hebron at the moment, in Judea and Samaria, that is trying to safeguard the inheritance or the inheritance of the Jewish nation. But people are now from the other side of the table, if you like, acquiring culture that was actually not theirs, and that is called cultural appropriation. Now, to build a Muslim temple on top of, or not a temple, but it's a mosque, which you could argue is a temple, on the exact place of where the Jewish second temple was, sort of the only holy place to worship God, is of, let's say, striking intent or coincidence, if you are on that side of thinking. And so a rumor was spread that the Jews were going to occupy the Al-Aqsa mosque and let it and blow it up. Now, that is not true. That was one of the many lies that started to occur. And the Grand Mufti, he played a key role in the propaganda to spread this news. And you know what it is with propaganda. You know, you hear a story and you think, okay, well, it doesn't sound right. And then, you know, there comes another news article, and then there's leaflets. And at some stage, you know, the proverbial bucket is going to be overflowing because of the last drop. And riots occurred to such an extent that it started to turn out really bad for the Jews. Now, the Jews in Hebron, they were warned by other Jews in other parts of the land of Palestine that there was something brewing, and they had to be on their guard. And they said, we have lived with these people for many years in peace. Let us talk to them, and let us, because they were going to each other's weddings, for goodness sake. So it was not like they were arch enemies at all. The other Jews actually also started to sort of protect themselves by organized militia. And this is the formation of the Haganah. Haganah is the predecessor of the RDF. When the Jews started to realize that the Brits were not going to help them and that they were actually surrounded by enemies, they thought, well, if we want to survive, we got to either die or we have to protect ourselves. Anyway, so the Jews in Hebron, they decided, no, we have lived with these people. That can't be possible. Anyway, long story short, they were wrong. And at some stage, riots erupted for over a week. The Brits tried to get it under control. Extreme violence took place, and over 100 Jews were murdered. And we have to use the word murder in a similar way as October the 7th in 2023, because Arabs turned towards their Jewish neighbors, invaded their houses. They committed atrocities similar to what happened on October the 7th. Men were castrated. Girls were raped in front of their families. Mothers were raped in front of their families. And so it goes on. And that was because of propaganda first, and then people started to believe a lie, and a lie turns into murder. It's nothing new, you could argue. There was over the centuries, the Jews have been accused of all sorts of things. Libels, they call that. Some were blood libels. There was one picture from the Middle Ages that Jews were drinking the blood of Christian babies. And people started to believe that, and subsequent murders took place as well. So that pattern of anti-Semitism has not actually stopped. And so in August 1929, the Grand Mufti of Palestine, Amin al-Husseini, he was the instigator. Now you would think that that would actually call for action, or to condemn that, or at least arrest them, because the Brits were, after all, administering the land of Palestine. And so he was going completely out of his jurisdiction and incited this whole business of these riots and the atrocities that followed. It is they didn't, the Brits, and so that was, of course, infuriating. In New York City, 35,000 people took to the streets and protested against this absolute poor management of the land of Palestine and dealing with this. There was an inquiry, and they took witness reports, witness statements from all people involved. Turned into a heavy report of 400 pages, which is somewhere in Britain available for researchers. So it's all well documented, but at the end of the day, the Grand Mufti was not convicted. In fact, he carried on, and it became worse. He started to become more powerful. And the Grand Mufti, he also developed a group of people around him, which you can call his henchmen, and that anybody who opposed him, that would see the consequences of that. Now, that also has a parallel of what we have seen in the last 25 years in the current Middle East. So there were a few mayors of cities and villages that actually were keen to develop future progress and developments with the Jewish population, which, like I said before, was 40 and 60%. But they were actually forced to not do that, and if they did, they were assassinated, and so they were. So they killed their own as well. So it was like the mob, and we've seen that coming back, of course, in what we have seen today and in the last 20 years in Gaza, and not only in Gaza but also in Lebanon. That was and could be terrorized again by Hezbollah, and so this actually it started about 100 years ago. This conflict anyway. So the Grand Mufti. He grew in strength, in power, and when in 1936 there was a new proposal to divide the land, and with a sort of a bi-nation kind of proposal where there was a part for the Arabs and a part for the Jews, he rejected that, and so that was the first sort of, you could say, the two-state solution, if you like. And he rejected that because he was of the mind that no Jews should be living in this particular area at all. So it was a very, this was the beginning, I think, of that conflict, an old conflict, but it was revived in a sense with this massive event in 1929. 1936, of course, is very close to the beginning of the Second World War, where in Europe the Nazi Party had gained huge powers and were pretty much on their way to start a war in Europe. In that particular time, there were more riots and unrest in Palestine, and the Brits, they were getting really tired of this business because they were asked to administer it and find a solution, and then all these parties were fighting with each other. When the Haganah began to develop in a more organized militia, and later, like I said, became the IDF in today's in the state of Israel, or earlier actually, but they actually began to defend themselves, and from defense it went into offense, and so there were bad things done by both parties to each other. Not to the extent of the massacre of unarmed people. This was just pretty much warfare between two people groups. So we're getting close to 1940 and 1945, or we should say 1939, because that's when the Second World War started.
And you wanted to share something about your dad in the war to do with that?
Yes. So we all know and that the Second World War was a war that was started by Germany. Germany found some allies, Mussolini in Italy, and then later on Japan, with their own sense of superiority, started to conquer the Pacific. And both nations, Japan and Germany, were well-organized nations when it came to industrial production or military or hardware, but also they had a style of fast warfare. In German it's called Blitzkrieg. Blitz is like fast and Krieg means war. And so the Germans, I just drove over the borders of Poland. That's how the Second World War started, pretty much. Leading up, of course, to that business was Lord Chamberlain, who went to talk to Adolf Hitler, and he came back to England flying, and this treaty or pact or letter where he said, "Now it's all going to be good. We're not going to have war with Adolf Hitler." And there was only one man who said, you cannot trust Adolf Hitler and his ideology, and what they are doing is something we need to be really careful with, so don't trust him an inch. Regrettably, he was right, because not shortly thereafter, Germany declared war to various other nations, and later on Britain. And the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he was the one who said that. You're taken for a ride by Adolf Hitler. And so, anyway, so the Second World War is, of course, the world is full of documentaries and books and stuff like that. And so in 1944, which we now know was sort of a year before the end of the Second World War, the Germans were getting lower on men and supply, particularly men. And so what they did, they actually rounded up a whole lot of men from other countries they had occupied to work for them in mines, in factories. So these were not Jews; they were just normal citizens, you know. And in 1944, there was a so-called razzia of Rotterdam. Razzia is a word for roundup. It's an Italian word. Basically, they rounded up 44,000 or 40,000 men that actually were taken from their homes, from the city of Rotterdam where my dad lived, and they were shipped off to the Eastern Front where the Russians were advancing to build reinforcements and stuff like that. And on the way to southern Germany, there was one lot that went to southern Germany. It was all in trains. They were bombed by the RAF, the Royal Air Force, because by then they were dominating the skies, because Germany was bombed till smithereens. And so they lost a lot of their infrastructure and air superiority. And so they had to get out of those trains. And my dad found himself with a whole lot of others, of these people of Rotterdam, in a place called Dachau, which we now know there was a concentration camp. And he was 17. He was part of the cleanup crew. He called it the cleanup crew. I didn't know what that meant when he told me the story years ago. But his job was, amongst all the others that were employed,
quote unquote,
there, to pull people out of barbed wire that actually committed suicide. And so he looked into the camp for regularly. And he saw people that resembled Jew. And there were a lot of Jews in those camps. There were also homosexuals. We call them gay today. These were gypsies and disabled people as well. Just like all the other concentration camps, they were exterminated. And we know that the Jews, they exterminated 6 million of them on an industrial scale. And so my dad was there, 17 years old, and he couldn't actually explain more about it, and he never actually spoke after that about that experience in his life. But it was enough for him to say that whatever religion, whatever person you are, whatever color of your skin, nobody should deserve such a treatment like I have seen. And he was on the outside of the camp, so he was the lucky one, you could argue, despite the fact that he had to do a horrible job. So when he got married and he got kids of his own, he brought that home to us. So for me, maybe it started there for me already to have respect. I wasn't a saint by any stretch of imagination, but there was something there that I should have respect for people despite what they believe or are, and religion. And so although I was raised as a non-Christian, that was something that he told us. So that was a very dark time in Europe in general, but it also he survived the war, obviously. He escaped from that area and so forth, and he walked back to the Netherlands.
Wow.
From southern Germany. It was quite a journey.
Southern Germany. Wow. Germany is huge compared to Holland. That's a
Yeah,
long journey.
I think he told me there was he walked back about 1,000 kilometers.
Wow.
So he was 17 and I think he was 18 when he came back. Yeah. Amazing stories. There's thousands, tens of thousands of those stories. But this was my dad's story about that he. So he never actually made fun of Jews, and in that sense, he respected them. And
it's grievous, really. I don't know other word that people will still say that it didn't happen, and I guess we see similarities of that now, of denying what has happened in recent events, or even denying what happened during World War II. And when you hear stories like that, or even other stories that I've heard of personal survivors, I just think, how can you say that?
The Nazis, for some reason, had in their mind that the Jews were an Untermensch, they called them. Unter means under, and Mensch is human. It's like a subhuman kind of.
Yeah.
And let's go back to 1929 to the Grand Mufti. So the Grand Mufti was still in the land of Palestine before 1940, and then a British official was killed. And then the Brits took action and issued an arrest warrant. So this was interesting. There was hundreds of Jews were killed, first in 1929 by a mob, and then after that, all the skirmishes and fighting, Arabs died, Jews died, Druze died, and then the Brits were sick of that, tried to keep order, and they didn't take action on the instigator of the whole situation, because that was the Grand Mufti. And finally, when a British citizen dies, then they take action. And so he fled the country. He fled to Iraq. He instigated a pogrom against the Jews in Iraq. So about 1,000 Jews lost their lives over there. So, you go to a career interview and they ask you about a track record. Well, he has an amazing track record with Grand Mufti of the land of Palestine. And anyway, so this was getting close to the Second World War. That actually, in fact, had already started. So they chased him towards Iraq, and then he fled to Europe. And he was received by the Nazis as a pure Aryan. He was considered by Adolf Hitler personally as a pure Aryan of a different kind of the Middle East.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and he actually got a royal treatment. He got his own chauffeur and an apartment, and he was actually well paid. And he became friends with Joseph Goebbels. Now, that is an interesting part of history to understand, because Joseph Goebbels, he was the Minister of Propaganda. So propaganda in 1929, propaganda in the 1930s was it was a fine art executed by Joseph Goebbels, and they portrayed the Jews and the Bolsheviks, the Russians, with cartoon pictures and writings, and they portrayed, and so they made the population ripe for murder. Mass murder. And so this Grand Mufti Husseini, he actually became a good friend of him, of Goebbels. And they actually appointed him to be the representative of the German Empire, or the Reich, in the Middle East, and set up a similar system of extermination of the Jews in the Middle East. So he learned, he was already good at propaganda, spraying lies, and then subsequently, he became pals with Goebbels and Adolf Hitler himself, the masterminds of the destruction of the world, pretty much, in 1940, 1945. The UN by then was followed up by the League of Nations, and they issued, after the Second World War, an arrest warrant for war crimes. He fled to France, from France to Egypt, and from Egypt to Lebanon, and he started in Lebanon his own jihad against the, this was 1946, 1947, and he started his jihad from Lebanon. Now, I don't know what is going on in Lebanon at this stage exactly, but there's also a similarity that on October the 7th in 2023, Hezbollah, or pronounced Hezbollah because of the language, was very strongly embedded in Lebanon, and also started a jihad, a holy war, translated, against the state of Israel from the north. So history seems to repeat itself along the same lines. And so by that stage, 1947, the Brits were sick and tired of this whole business, and they wanted to get out of that land, and they had left the land partitioned on a map with the United Nations. As for anybody who is interested in research, it is you can access that. There are also maps been drawn up, but these are false maps by people that propose to be pro-Palestine. It is clear that in these days that Husseini was just waging a jihad in 1947. That is prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. And they started a war and waged war on actually a non-existing state. This whole business of, that Israel is not willing to negotiate or want to have peace and they are the evil state and all that kind of stuff. These are simple lies. You can't, because history has shown that is not the case. It's been documented. It's been documented by officials and so forth. Then we are getting close to, so 1947 was already tumultuous with this war from the north, and people getting mobilized to fight. And so in 1948, in May, 15th of May, David Ben-Gurion announces the establishment of the State of Israel. Well, before that actually happened, that announcement, the Jews had accepted the proposal from the United Nations. It was actually land given to them, which was marginal land or swamps, as neglected. The Brits, when they conquered the land of Palestine, they found the land was neglected. There were swamps infested with mosquitoes, and malaria was widespread, and it was not a well-kept land. And like I said before, the land that the Jews bought was from absent landowners, were wealthy landowners. So they were not taking an interest in it. And so the population division was 60-40, and by 1947 there were about 1 million people in that land. So there was a lot of space for just 1 million people in that particular area, compared to what number of people living there now. So space wouldn't be an issue for those particular people groups. The Jews accepted most of the proposals by the Brits because they were really finally pleased, or pleased is not really the word, is exalting or excited, or with the fact that after 2,000 years they have a homeland again on the place where their father Abraham and Isaac and Jacob lived, given by God. But that was rejected by by the Arabs of the time. The surrounding nations rejected it, and then the State of Israel was announced on May the 15th, 1948.
Yeah. So what can you tell us about that, about the establishment of actual Israel as,
Well,
a proper nation?
yes. So the Jews embraced the land that was given to them, but that was short-lived because after that announcement, the surrounding nations attacked the young state of Israel. After about a year, the Jews had been able to throw the Arabs back, the Arab nations that attacked them from all sides, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. I mean, Jordan was not even a state. The Jordan Hashemite family was actually a Saudi family that was placed there by the Brits to rule that particular land they allotted to them, and yet they actually invaded the land of Israel as well, or the territories, because it was not really the land like it was today, and Egypt from the south, and so there was I think it was five nations that attacked Israel. After a year of fighting and so forth, they threw these Arab nations back. They conquered land, and it is interesting that these five nations that actually said to the Arabs in that particular area, please move out of the way so we can actually push them into the sea, the Mediterranean. And but then they had a problem, because after a year of fighting, the Israelis had actually conquered a lot of territory that was allocated to the Arabs, and which they had rejected outright on two occasions, in 1936 and later on in 1947. So that was constant rejection. So after a year of fighting, which was hardly a state, they managed to repel them and actually conquer areas. And the thing is that, there's a lot of people on the streets that we have seen since October the 7th, is that, from the river to the sea and all that chanting. It is a genocidal chant that actually says, get rid of the Jews. I've seen interviews with students at universities in the United States when we're asked, what river are you talking about, that they not even knew what kind of river it was. So you wonder what kind of background there is or knowledge about these things. But it was so this was not about living in coexistence together. There was just one aim, and the point was made by the Grand Mufti. We just don't want the Jews living here. Yeah. Even if we have lived in coexistence and went to each other's weddings, we just don't want you. And so they started to spread lies, and they started murdering their opponents. And that pattern hasn't stopped either, because they murdered their own. And so Israel then held on to these territories, and one territory that they didn't conquer from the Arab nations that invaded them was Judea and Samaria, that stayed under Jordanian rule. It was also interesting, we forget to say that the partition plan was that the Gaza Strip was not going to be part of Israel. Right. That was on the Egyptian rule.
Right. Yes.
So, in 1967, there was another war. There was a conflict in between in 1956. It was the Suez Crisis, but let's not expand on that. But we go to 1967, and in 1966, around about that time, there was a new organization, and they were called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. Now, it was interesting that the Grand Mufti of Palestine, he had a nephew, and that nephew was in awe of his uncle. And he also fought in 1947 in the jihad against the non-state of Israel, because there was no state of Israel, there was still a land of Palestine. And his name was Yasser Arafat. And Yasser Arafat, he became the leader of the PLO. And he was obviously, through his uncle, well schooled in the art of manipulation, lies, and propaganda. And for many, many years, the Israelis never wanted to negotiate with him until later in the 80s that they saw grounds to negotiate with him. But it was the same pattern that he followed as well. But in 1967, again, Israel was attacked by the surrounding nations. This time there were 7 of them, and but they were prepared, and the Israeli army defeated all these invading armies in 7 days, masterfully. They conquered the Sinai, which was previously part of Egypt. They conquered the Gaza Strip, because that was part of Egypt as well. They also conquered the West Bank, and with that, the Jews could finally go back to praying at the west, at the Wailing Wall, at the wall, where they pray. I forgot the name now. There's a Jewish word for that. And in the north, they conquered the Golan Heights, and the Golan Heights have been used by the Syrians just to have target practice on the Jewish farmers down below for a long time. And so they conquered all that area, and it was even that. So they actually had to be stopped to throw the advancing armies or the invaders back. And they were a few kilometers before the gates of Damascus when the United Nations said, please stop, because, where's this going to go? So one of the things that when you hang out over the years with some military friends and you listen to some podcasts and you read a few books, Norman Schwarzkopf, the general who led the first Gulf War against Iraq, who starts a war must bear the consequences. And if you start a war and you lose, then you never get that land back. That is a very normal thing to do in warfare. But not the Israelis. And the Israelis, Egypt protested greatly against the loss of the Sinai. And which is interesting because they were also part of these invaders. A number of shortly thereafter, the Israelis, I think it was Menachem Begin, the prime minister, he decided that if we swap land for peace, then at least we have peace with the Egyptians. So they gave back the Sinai, and that was the first peace deal was signed between Israel and Egypt. Subsequently, he was murdered by the Muslim Brotherhood later on, Sadat. So, this is another sort of pattern. The Grand Mufti started killing his opponents, assassinating them. And so, just to continue that mafia kind of practice. So, 1966, the Israelis said the Sinai and the Gaza, you can have it back. But they refused to get the Gaza back. And so the Gaza stayed under Israeli rule from then onwards. And they tried for many years to give it back, but the Egyptians refused. Now that's an interesting thing. Why would the Egyptians not get that land back? I think a lot of people don't know that or don't realize that. Why is that?
Okay, so tell us why they wouldn't want it back, because that's an important thing to mention then?
Well, it is very important. So we all know there is a war going between Russia and Ukraine. Started almost 3 years ago. And because of that war, the Russians invaded the Ukraine. The Ukraine was about to become a member of NATO, and the Russians wanted their territory back for whatever reason. Maybe there was a historical claim, I don't know. I'm not so familiar with that conflict, so I can't say much to that. I know one thing, that the European Union, 22 member states, absorbed 6.5 million refugees.
Wow.
So let's repeat it again. 6.5 million refugees.
That's a lot of people.
A lot of people. When we had the extreme Islam jihadist group ISIS from 2015 onwards, that were trying to establish a caliphate in Syria and parts of Iraq. Syrians fled. Turkey absorbed a whole lot of millions of Syrians as refugees on their southern border, Turkey. And a whole lot of Syrians fled the war zone and fled to Europe. And I know, because of my German friend, that Germany absorbed 350,000 Syrians into their society. After 1948, when the armies of the surrounding nations invaded Israel, which was just starting, they said to these people that lived there, just get out of the way, so we wiped them into the sea. Well, they could never return. So what do you do with these people? And that is a problem that they have created themselves. That is not the state of Israel that has created that problem.
Yeah.
So they have constantly rejected any proposal for peace or land for peace and so forth. But none of it has actually materialized positively. 1982, that's when we saw the Lebanese war exploding, and that particular displaced group was one of the instigators of that civil war into Lebanon. Well, Lebanon, the capital of Lebanon is Beirut, and that was considered the Paris of the Middle East. It was razed to the ground over the duration of the civil war. And they had a big part to play in there. They caused unrest, these displaced people, in the new state of Jordan. And the king of Jordan was sick of it, and he went to sort it out. He hired some Pakistani troops, and they murdered tens of thousands of these people. So, you don't hear much about that. So why is that? Why did nobody actually absorb these people into their countries? And that is a question that they have to answer, that I cannot answer. I have an idea, but I don't think it is good for me to give any thought to that, because it is a huge problem, and we're talking about humans here, not units.
Right.
And so that's it's been a sad story. And if you think about this problem, about the Arab, the Palestine Arabs, the Palestina Arabs, they started to call themselves, when the PLO came into force, Palestinians, as if these were the people of the land. It was a fabrication that suited the narrative. And the narrative was to just throw the Jews out at any means possible. I think we have to step back, go back to 1948, and maybe read the book of Ezekiel 37 in this sense.
Okay. Hey friends, to listen to the final part of this series, please click the link in the video description or find it anywhere that you listen to your podcasts. I hope you enjoyed part 2.